It's a pleasure to be here, and I would like to express my gratitude for the invitation to take part in this conference, and at the same time I would like to apologize for not being here this morning, which is really a pity since I missed all those wonderful papers that I'm sure inspired a lot of discussion. So I will try to give you a summary basically of my papers, since I suppose everyone is tired, and I know for myself that that's the case. So I'll try to be as brief as possible so that we can have more time for discussion later on. So the topic of my presentation, the title is nationalism the only real substance of institutional orthodoxy? And of course, when asked that way, someone might object, what kind of stupid question is that? Because it can easily be answered that, of course, nationalism is not the only real substance or the only substance of institutional orthodoxy, because there are other things as well, such as money and power and all of these things. But nevertheless, I think that orthodoxy, the problem with nationalism in orthodoxy still remains, and in spite of many other problematic parts of the institutional church, nationalism still remains one of the most pressing issues for orthodoxy. A couple of words about just some definitions. What do we mean when we use these words, the concept of nationalism? And the way I define nationalism is really a simple one, so it's not a very sophisticated definition, but nevertheless I think it might be useful for the purposes of this presentation. So by nationalism, I mean the state of fascination with certain political collective, its identity, whether that be a tribe, ethnicity, ethnic group, or nation, which prevents critical evaluation of that political community, its institutions, policies, and ideologies. And in this sense, nationalism is closely related to another concept, statism, which clearly refers directly to the state and the same fascination and the same lack of critical capacity to critically examine state policies to which one belongs. When we look at the history of Christianity in particular, but we can also talk about religious institutions more generally, we see that there is a strong connection between religious institutions, institutional church, in the case of Christianity, and states, and state ideologies, and state policies. Institutional church tend to align with the political institutions and develop narratives that contextualize, rationalize, and solidify state policies or national ideologies. This is, of course, not something that is typical only of Orthodoxy. I'm sure that many papers discussed during this conference the situation also within the Orthodox world and also outside of it. But of course I'll focus my paper on the Orthodox Church just as a parallel how actual and acute this problem is. I read relatively recently the document of the Bishops' Conference of Poland that discusses the issue of patriotism and nationalism, and I understood that as an attempt to counter-fight nationalism. But the problem there is that very often when institutional church tries to do that, and this is the case for Poland, but the same logic actually you can find in all the Orthodox churches. Another concept is advanced as cure to nationalism, and that's some kind of healthy patriotism that's very often advocated. And that, to me, is probably even more problematic because trying to use sophisticated theological concepts, theologians and church people very often actually end up in solidifying those state policies and national identities, pretending that there could be a good patriotism from a Christian perspective. So I'm not doubting that there might be good patriotisms from other perspectives, but I'm highly critical of the idea that there is a good patriotism from a Christian perspective, of course, unless we mean by that patriotism when it comes to the kingdom of God, as Christians are citizens of the eschatological kingdom of God, not any other kingdom on this, in this world and in the process of history. The situation in the Orthodox world is particularly interesting because during the period of modernity we witnessed to the very unfortunate situation that we arrived at a certain stage when even theology uses concepts such as national church as a valid and acceptable one, identifying itself with the local territory, state territory, and local national identities. There is, of course, no time now to go back in history and try to trace back all these developments, but I'm sure that everyone here is familiar with the main stages in this process. The situation becomes particularly problematic when it comes to the organization of the church, and that is where nationalism plays a specific role in the Orthodox context, where Orthodox churches, local Orthodox churches, find it very difficult to even see the problem, let alone to counterfight it. Unlike the Roman Catholic Church, which at least institutionally speaking is an international organization, at least over the last 500 years or so, where there is one center and then more or less branches of the church in local context. We still see there, as in this example from Poland, how difficult it is even within the church organized in such a way to avoid the concepts such as nationalism or good patriotism is something that the church affirms. And it is even more difficult to do that in the case of Orthodoxy, because there is a perception, both popular perception, but also in theological discourses, that it is a normal situation that a certain nation, certain ethnic collective has its own church, and even we use those words regularly, such as Russian Orthodox Church or Serbian Orthodox Church or Greek Orthodox Church, although theologically those concepts cannot be, I think, justified. That is of special importance in the case of autocephaly, and these days the situation in Ukraine is of particular interest not only to the Orthodox world but more generally. And in that case we can see how difficult it is to get out of the national or nationalistic mode of thinking about Orthodoxy and the church. So there are here many more experts in Ukraine than I am, so I'm not going to talk about that, but I'll just point to one curious, interesting fact about the current dispute there between Moscow, between these different jurisdictions in Ukraine and the ecumenical patriarchate, how even the ecumenical patriarchate that likes to promote itself as truly international and something like an entity that overcomes those parochial nationalisms that characterize other local Orthodox churches, that even the ecumenical patriarchate that back in the 19th century condemned ethnophilitisms or nationalisms now actually participates actively in the promotion of another type of nationalism. So which again tells us that nationalism certainly is not the only problem within the institution of orthodoxy. There is also local imperialisms that are attached to at least bigger local institutional Orthodox churches. So we can ask the question, why is this the case? Why is nationalism something that we cannot expel from the church? Why is it so strongly present both in history, and why even some theologians, and even more sophisticated theologians, very often try to argue in favor of some kind of nationalism or patriotism, affirm that and justify that using the concepts such as chosen people or Christian nation, trying somehow to reconcile Orthodox ecclesiology, the idea that those who belong to the church are those chosen people with political entities such as nation or an ethnic group. I think that apart from the general tendency that I mentioned at the beginning, that religious institutions tend to make friends with political institutions, and for those purposes nationalism comes handy as an ideology that both local communities need, but then that religious institutions also assume and affirm, and that has to do, I think, remarkably with power, because both institutional church and states are power agents. So that is why they need each other, unless the regime is openly anti-church or anti-Christian, such as, I don't know, the Soviet Union. But even in that case, we see episodes, but even such an openly ethnicist and anti-church regime actually tends to go and make friends with the church and vice versa when necessary and when needed. But in addition to that, I think the problem is specifically from Christian perspective that nationalism appears as false ecclesiology. Nationalism tends to de-eschatologize Christianity and the church. And my biggest problem with institutional church that affirms nationalism is not only that the church starts performing a political role, that the church starts defending certain national interests. Because one can argue that sometimes the defense of national interests can be justifiable from a political perspective. My biggest problem with that is that defending nationalism or affirming it, the church basically de-eschatologizes itself. Instead of focusing primarily on the reality of the kingdom of God and trying to do its mission in the world, distancing itself from all those ideologies that try to make kingdom of God present in history in the form of political institution, the church tends very often to align with the state, and then that way effectively undermines its own identity and its own mission. This false ecclesiology of nationalism, it offers to the people something that seems as structurally very similar to what Christians are supposed to experience within the church context. If we go back to some of the most influential theologies within the Orthodox world in the 20th century, we'll see how important in those theological discourses are the concepts such as communion, church's communion, liturgical community as a place where we have a foretaste of the kingdom of God, and how that community is vital for establishing our own identities as true human beings, or in words of John Zizioulas, as persons, as opposed to being just individuals. Well, that community of the faithful is supposed to be based on love, which allows us to overcome our individual identities and establish ourselves as beings of and in communion with others, to paraphrase again Zizioulas. This is something that nationalistic discourses within the Orthodox Church and within the state that try to make friends with the Church actually exploit quite a lot. Because in those discourses, nation as a political entity functions as a substitution for the Church. It is not by chance that most of the right-wing discourses that try to present themselves as Christians exploit precisely that idea, the false idea of an ecclesial community, and transfer that idea into the political realm, basically claiming that we should function within the political community in a way that's similar to the idea of ecclesial community, which means that we should be somehow united, that we should love the nation or that collective identity, and that the primary source of our identity as individuals or persons comes out of the identification or belonging to that community, which is structurally similar to what we in Orthodox ecclesiology might expect from the church community, and it is clearly visible how that concept is kidnapped from its ecclesial context and applied to the political community, which of course then produces all sorts of problems as one political community or nation is defined as an organic whole to which supposedly everyone should belong, and nobody should try to critically examine, to distance him or herself vis-a-vis that community or particular ideologies, because that is then considered not only unpatriotic, but it can also be read and attacked from this false ecclesiology and metaphysics as basically endangering our very survival as the members of that community and human beings. So now at the very end of this presentation, which is, as you can see, just sharing with you a couple of preliminary ideas that I hope we can discuss more later on. I would just like also to say something how actually even those nationalisms that I just described as false ecclesiologies or false metaphysics when viewed from Christian or specifically Orthodox Christian perspectives, how even they can sometimes play a positive role vis-a-vis other harmful political ideologies and discourses that we are witnessing today, but of course it is not just today. We have also many examples from earlier periods. What I have in mind is primarily what I think is one of the biggest problems for the survival of the species and the planet nowadays, and that is the unrestrained spread of neoliberalism, neoliberal dogmas, and neoliberal and also the institutions that come in the same package with neoliberal ideology, meaning the multinational corporations that actually pose a significant a significant threat to human communities worldwide, not to mention, of course, problems such as ecological disasters and so on and so forth. Well, very often, and that is another problem with nationalism and specifically in the church context, very often people tend to criticize those neoliberal policies and the corporate world by going back to the idea of authentic nation states and see the solution to those problems in the affirmation of particular national states and nationalisms or nationalism inclined ideologies. This is the situation that we more or less have with the right, far right, ultra right in Europe nowadays, where in more or less all the cases, relevant cases, is going back to the national sovereignty is perceived as a solution to the threats that are coming from the neoliberal agendas that have been implemented now for a very long time. And sometimes we even see strange kinds of hybrids that, for the purposes of political propaganda, would attack those internationalist policies, but would actually inside implement pretty much the same policies that we find in the classical neoliberal dogma. This is something that I see is particularly relevant nowadays in the Orthodox world, because we witness the rise of those intellectuals and theologians who actually exploit theological discourse and nationalism within the theological discourse as an antidote to these problems that are real, that are relevant. But of course, I'm not sure that that solution is the solution to these problems. And then very often we end up in the state of paranoia, or we develop those discourses that are very harmful both in the political realm and specifically in the ecclesial one. So that is basically everything I wanted to share with you, and I would be happy to discuss any of these points further, and I hope we could benefit from your own experiences and your own ideas as to these topics.
We have 2 minutes for questions.
Thank you for your very interesting, also very radical discourse. And I feel very happy with it. Your critique on nationalism and its relation to churches, your last remark on neoliberalism, that also I think is a very strong point. But I have one more question, and that's about the following. I did my presentation yesterday morning, and in it I critiqued a document of the World Council of Church of Faith and Order. They had a document some 10 years ago on nationalism. And in fact, 2 decades ago, they started with a project on nationalism. And what I critiqued in it is that they said at a certain moment in the document, so I thought it was good, but the theological aspects were weak. And for me the big problem was that what they in the document did was, they said that once you become a Christian, you've got a new identity in Christ, then it looks a lot like what you are telling. We are no kingdom of God is for us. At the problem with this is that if you tell it like this, you take away the reality that at the same time we are not only Christians, but for example, we have also, so if I'm baptized, that's what I told yesterday, if I'm baptized, then I still have my Flemish, Dutch origin and roots. I can't take them away and they will stay. So my question is, our identities are layered identities. And if we then say, well, we have a new identity in Christ, that that's something that I feel very strong to. At the same time, it's much more complicated. And my question for you is how to deal with this complexity of our layered identities.
Thank you for that very relevant question and a difficult one. I agree, there are of course multiple identities. The problem with nationalism and national identity is that it is in some respects very different from those other identities. It is very different from our identity, let's say, as our professional identity, whether we are doctors or bus drivers or anything else. It is different in this regard that, first of all, it is completely fictional, and the reason why it is problematic for me is that you get that identity through a tremendous oppression that comes from normally the state or other institutions. So there is nothing, I don't see anything natural about it. It is actually installed through a very long process of oppression to get to something that we know now as our nations. There is nothing normal about it.
You mean it's constructed?
It's constructed but violently imposed. And by violently, let's take just one example among many that we could name. The formation of modern nations was linked with extermination of local languages, for instance. So you take one dialect only, you make it the national language, and then you impose it through state propaganda, scholarship, everything else, so you extinguish, not to mention, of course, radical oppression against certain minorities. That was always the case. You take any example you want there in order to establish that identity. And then, of course, it continues to reputation and everything else. So that's why when you say that we, by becoming Christians, that position, if I'm paraphrasing it correctly, that position takes us
takes away our
right.
That is only relevant reality in which we live.
Right. That we are, in some sense, we are going out of or distancing ourselves from reality. I don't see why. No, we are not distancing ourselves from it. We are immersing ourselves into reality. But why is our immersion in this reality linked with affirmation of national identity? That's the thing that I can't see. So why can't we stay in this reality, stay in this world, work in this world, not run away, because there is no running away, there is no easy way out. We are becoming Christians, and then, first of all, by being baptized, we are not becoming Christians. We are starting the process of becoming a Christian, which can be finished only in the kingdom of God. That's the next category. So, and we are manifesting ourselves as Christians precisely by immersing ourselves in the world and trying to change ourselves before anything else. So, why is the affirmation of national identities part of that story? I think that actually the process of our transformation, which is happening in the world and in history, part of that is the deconstruction of those false identities that are imposed there for the sake of preservation of power structures. So if we take Christianity seriously, I think we should critically address them, because there is nothing Christian about state structures, there is nothing Christian about national identity. Those are violent ideologies that I think Christians should oppose. Now, I'm not, you call it radical position. I don't think it's radical at all. I think it's a mild position that just if we take Christianity, we need to take that position. And I'm not advocating revolutionary methods there. I don't believe that that is the right way. I think that through the process of education and changing our lives individually and then working together, these things can be changed without going through some radical process that would just end up in another political ideology that will be the revolution.
Не тот микрофон ты берешь.
Oh, sorry.
I want to push a little bit further on what Eddie was asking, and I think that he's right about something. So I'm completely against the kind of violent impositions, and we certainly the church needs to condemn violently imposed identity, be it national or whatever. But churches have to absorb all sorts of violently imposed identities. Look on family. If you take Zisulas, he says, oh, in the church, your biological links stop being relevant, and your father is in heaven, your brothers and sisters are members of the church. But still today, most churches, the Russian Orthodox Catholic, they do nothing else but protect the family and sacred values of the family, etc. And yet, the family, a monogamic family, has been imposed very violently in Europe and elsewhere. So it's one identity, not identity, but one group of, association which has been violently imposed, and the church is very happy with that and sees almost the nature of its presence in our society, the family. Territorial units. The church has been historically happy with parishes, dioceses, with canonical territory invented by Father Inakenti, who was here. And yet it also came with violence, state pushing wars, etc. And yet the church absorbed it and deals with it. So is there anything kind of different with national identity? Certain cultural, linguistical, whatever habits. And can there be no identity? Is not cosmopolitanism also the sort of identity with its own roots, be it neoliberal, relativist, postmodern, etc. Thank you. And I really like it. It's not a criticism, just a genuine interest.
No, I think, thank you for that, and I agree with what you said. So yes, there are other concepts and institutions that have also been violently imposed and the church absorbed. But why should you be surprised by that? As I said, institutional church is a violent power agent. It's based on power structures. So it's not at all surprising that it functions in a way that is very similar to political institutions. And I also don't say it's a longer discussion, but I don't think that the church in, let's say, metaphysical sense, or the church community, as per our liturgy, and there I follow Zisioulas and his ecclesiology. They are so that the primary manifestation of the church is the liturgical community and the Eucharistic offering. So I don't think that that's completely a separate thing from the institutional church, but it's certainly not the same. So the connection between, from my perspective, between the institutional church and the liturgy is a complex one. But I would never identify the institutional church with the church in this liturgical and physical sense, meaning the idea of the kingdom of God. Because by being an institution of this world, it actually diminishes its iconic role. So the more church is an institution, the less it is capable of recognizing the kingdom of God. And by becoming an institution and by being concerned with all these things, national interests, politics, money, family, all of that, it actually imitates the concerns and institutions of this world. And family is a very good example there because, again, Christianity is very radical in this respect. It is, I think, the most energetic idea that appeared in history. It's very radical. It tries to radically transform these interhuman relationships. And if you think about it, yes, the idea that we should love each other and that should be the basis of our identity, that is a very radical idea. And I can't see how that can be applied in a political realm. So that's what many Orthodox theologians have, and especially in Orthodox traditional Orthodox countries, they have this claim that you find, in the West there is all that individualism and blah blah blah, and we advocate personalism and love, and we should organize society based on that. How on earth can you organize society based on love? I just can't see. I mean, you cannot organize even a family based on love, because you always have, I mean, even if there is love, you have all sorts of family violence that's built into the system in the sense. Right. But that's different from those family as a political and social institution. So how, because you have tensions, you have conflicts, how you can't even resolve them within a family always by referring to love, and how on earth can you do that for an entire political community or the state? So that's, I think, a completely crazy idea. But what you can do is try to change your own reality with those people you love. And that is that's a metaphysical orientation. That's something that has to do with our existence, and I think is very different from how we organize society. Because there must be, and I'm not advocating in political realm some kind of radical pacifism. I'm completely aware that to organize a political community, sometimes we need violent procedures and institutions, because it's a violent act if you try to stop a murderer from murdering everyone they want to murder. So it is a violent act to put them in prison, but nevertheless it is necessary. And that's where I think the church and its logic and its metaphysics, which should be always concerned with freedom and love, is different in its basic identity from the state and state institutions, and that should be maintained. So we should live with that tension, embrace the tension, not try to artificially resolve it and harmonize it, because I think that's very dangerous. We are diminishing the mission of the church and the meaning of Christianity.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to ask something about one aspect you mentioned. You said that the church de-eschatologizes itself when it comes together, for example, with nationalism, and I was a little bit reminded of a debate which we had in Germany in, I think, 2007, after the visit of Pope Benedict XVI in Germany. During this visit, he advocated a withdrawal from the world. That's what he called it. So the church had to withdraw from the world. And we had a big debate what such a withdrawal would mean, actually. And my question is, in your concept, what place does, for example, have an ecclesiological dimension as, for example, the diaconia? What is the place of this in your concept? Doesn't mean your concept in the last consequences maybe a fixation on liturgy? Maybe you can clarify this.
Sure. Well, I'm very skeptical when it comes to the idea of withdrawal from the world. I don't see that first of all, I don't understand what it means. What it means to withdraw from the world. I mean, you can even suicide probably, that's the withdrawal. So I see that the church and Christians are present there, and we are going back to the other part of actually your question that I forgot about, how to deal with these multiple identities. We are not, I don't think we can artificially get rid of them, or that we should get rid of them. No, they in many ways define who we are. But one thing is, national identity that is, I think, a fictional category. Another thing is, for example, some more tangible things such as local, regional identity that we have as people who are born and raised somewhere and eat certain kind of food and have certain, properties and speak certain languages and all that. So that defines us pretty much. Doesn't define us metaphysically in the sense that if we have one of these properties, that automatically means this or that. But it is the way in which we, using all of those things, we articulate Christian message and try to live Christian life. My problem with national identity is that I don't see how that can be transformed in a Christian way. Because the thing with all these particular identities is to transform them from something that is external, from something that defines us as individuals, into something making them work to actually develop ourselves as Christians and actualize our potentialities. So if we speak a certain language, then certainly we can use that language. There is nothing metaphysical per se in that language, but we can use that for, let's say, missionary purposes. If we are, I don't know, big enough, we can use our physical strength, which certainly does not define us as in a metaphysical sense, but it can be used instead of being someone to, help someone. So that's what I mean by the transformation, which I don't think national identity, nationalism can be transformed in any meaningful sense. So yes, when it comes to all sorts of activities in this world, I don't see any problems there, that is part of the church, who we are as Christians, to try to also transform our immediate surrounding, and of course we help those who are helped, because that's the way how we manifest that love that is the only metaphysically relevant thing. But another thing is obviously, of course, if that becomes the only thing, if we are, how to put it, if we are organizing any activity in an abstract way in order to achieve a particular goal, and if that goal is not just transformation of our existence and acts of love, that is what I see as problematic. That is something that, again, has the potential to diminish the identity of the church. But if the choice is, of course, between a church that forgets about any of the metaphysical stuff but still helps people, and the church who forgets about metaphysical stuff and doesn't do anything for the people, yes, of course, I will always support the church that helps people, even if it means forgetting about metaphysical identities. It's useful.
Any more questions? Sorry.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. And actually, practical question. I know you have a certain background and you know what's going on in a certain church. So the question is, could you imagine the situation when the national identity and other identities within the certain church, within your local church, would balance or even harmony? Don't say no, just think of the situation, how that would be.
Well, I can imagine all sorts of things, so I probably can imagine that as well. But whether the question is whether I think that that's realistic in any foreseeable future, I'm very skeptical. And that is also why the title, it seems to me that most of the time, what the institutional church talks about, thinks about, especially higher echelons of the church, it rarely, just read and listen to what an average bishop talks about. And what, for example, the General Council of Bishops normally, what they talk about when they issue documents after each of their assembly. Yeah, it is really difficult. Like, you need a microscope to find something that references to Christianity and anything. It's mostly national political stuff, and up to the point that even some, as I said, more sophisticated theologians don't actually see a problem in defining the church as a national institution. And interestingly enough, one of those in Serbian context, one of those people who is often cited on the far right, the nationalistic pole of the spectrum within the church, Yusuf Popovic, he actually said that many people keep forgetting that to turn this church into a national institution is a heresy. It is something that, even he goes even more and says, well, that is actually sin against the Holy Spirit. And there is no forgiveness for that. But there are, of course, in his own writings, many other problematic places where it seems that kind of many of these bridges between the institutional church and national identity and nation and state are established, and the church has the mission to promote national identity, national culture, national history, and all of that. So I'm not saying that the church should run away from history, from culture and context. No. I think it was a very good idea back in the Middle Ages that the church services were normally translated into local languages and were served in local languages. So that's one part of the process of interculturalization. That's what it means also to be present in the world and transport that, but it is still very different from turning the church into an institution that promotes nationalism and advocates political agendas.
Thank you, Davor.